Photoshop to Blender is a plugin that exports Photoshop files and recreates the same layers and groups inside Blender. Here we have a layered composition, where multiple elements are arranged into a complete background. This kind of setup is common in matte painting, concept art, and VFX workflows, where each layer represents a distinct visual element. Now we want to bring these layers into Blender to build a 3D scene, animate them, or use them in a larger pipeline. Exporting each layer manually would be slow and error-prone, especially when you have dozens or even hundreds of layers. The Photoshop to Blender plugin solves this by exporting all layers into a single .psl file. To use the plugin, we should go to File, Scripts, Photoshop to Blender. We'll cover export options later, so for now we just hit the Export button, enter a name, and save it as a .psl file. The export process may take some time depending on the file size and the number of layers. During export, the plugin captures each layer's data such as Z order, vector outline, and cropped image content. Once the export is complete, we switch to Blender and import the .psl file. The importer also has options like alignment and color management, but for now, we keep the defaults, and I will explain them later. All layers are imported under a Blender collection named after the original Photoshop file. Each layer becomes a curve object with UV mapping and a material already applied. The overall layout is preserved, so everything appears in Blender exactly where it was in Photoshop. The exporter crops each layer to its visible area, removing unnecessary transparent regions and reducing memory usage. You can also modify materials, adjust transparency, or animate individual elements as needed. From here you can move, rotate, or scale any layer independently. You will notice that each object has an outline border, which makes it easier to identify and manipulate compared to flat image planes. By default, the object pivot is aligned to the world origin, but you can easily recenter it to the object's geometry for more intuitive transformations. This workflow bridges the gap between 2D design and 3D production, making it fast and reliable to bring Photoshop compositions into Blender. If you want to know where the textures are saved, they are stored inside a folder with the same name as the .psl file, plus __psl, _data, __. Now let's start reviewing the export options, beginning with threshold. As you can see in the right image, a higher threshold value merges more points and produces a more optimized curve. Offset controls how much the curve expands before export. In the right example, the curve has a higher offset value, so the distance between the outline and the pixels is larger. Smooth defines how much the curve is smoothed. The curve on the right is very smooth and soft because the smooth value is higher. However, be careful not to increase smooth too much, otherwise some parts of the outline may be trimmed away. Besides bitmap layers, the exporter also supports vector layers such as shape and text layers. Here we have a few editable shape layers. We can move their control points and use the vector handles to reshape them. These layers are vector-based, so scaling them does not reduce their quality, which makes them ideal for creating curves in Blender. Before testing our exporter, let's first try the standard SVG format. To enable SVG export, we go to Preferences Export and enable Use Legacy. Now the SVG option is available in the File Export As dialog. The default parameters are fine, so we choose an output path and save the SVG file. Then, in Blender, we import it using File, Import, Scalable Vector Graphics.svg. There are no import parameters here. We simply click the Import button. Layers are imported separately, but we immediately notice some issues. All layers share the same material, which is not what we want. Another problem is that the layer's Z order is not transferred, so all layers sit at the same Z depth. Now let's export the same file again, but this time using our Photoshop to Blender plugin. Most of the export options are related to bitmap outlines, so we will leave them at their default values, choose an output path, and export. A single .psl file is created, which you can even move to another computer. Back in Blender, we open the file using File, Import, Photoshop to Blender. Here we have a few import options. I will explain them later. After clicking Import, you can see that all layers are brought in correctly. They are aligned with the front view and the colors are imported accurately. Each layer has the correct Z order, so the stacking order matches the original composition. If we rotate the SVG layers to match the front view, we can compare the two imports more easily. By selecting all of the shape layers and scaling them along the Y-axis, we can see that the layer depths match the original Photoshop layers. Another useful feature is that the tool installs a special geometry node setup. By default, curves are drawn with internal lines that look messy. Our tool adds a geometry node modifier that fills curves cleanly, making curves and control points easier to see in the viewport. Bitmap layers rely on textures, using curves as outlines, while vector layers like shapes or text export exact curve points. Control points and tangents go straight to Blender, with shape color mapped to the material for easy editing. Now let's review the import options one by one. The first option rotates all imported objects so they are aligned to the front view. If we disable it, you can see that the objects are imported with their default rotation. I will undo that change to keep them aligned. Another option controls the gap between each layer. If I increase this value, the layers are imported with more spacing between them along the Z-axis. There is also an option to set color management to standard. This is important if you want to see colors exactly the same as they appear in Photoshop. The last option controls the resolution of the curves. Lower values create more optimized and simpler curves, which is helpful if you plan to convert the curves to meshes and extrude them. This resolution value can also be adjusted later from the Properties panel of each layer. Higher values make the curves smoother and softer, and they help prevent the curves from looking low quality or jagged. Finally, let's talk about groups. Each Photoshop group is imported as a Blender collection with the same name. The full hierarchy of groups and layers from Photoshop is recreated in Blender.